This week's Africa Weekly Record is a lighter edition, but even in a quieter week, the same structural pressures remain: debt pressure, fuel pressure, and the question underneath them all: how much room governments still have to maneuver. Ghana has reached the final review stage of its IMF program. The country entered the program during severe debt and balance of payments pressure. Now, the IMF says inflation, reserves, and fiscal conditions have improved significantly. But this is not simply a story about leaving a bailout. It is also a test of whether stabilisation can survive after the emergency phase ends. Because many African economies now face tighter financing conditions, higher debt servicing pressure, and weaker global liquidity than during the earlier recovery phase. And that means Ghana's transition will be watched closely far beyond Ghana itself. Kenya raised fuel prices this week. Officials linked the increase to higher landed fuel costs connected to wider Middle East tensions and oil market pressure. And this is how global geopolitical pressure moves into African economies, not only through headlines, but through fuel, transport, food prices, and inflation. For oil importing economies, higher fuel costs widen fiscal pressure and complicate central bank decisions. Because once transport costs rise, the pressure often spreads through wider household systems, and that means global instability rarely remains distant for long. Across much of Africa, the deeper issue is becoming policy space. How much room governments still retain once debt pressure, fuel costs, and imported inflation begin rising. At the same time, S&P recently warned that African governments face roughly $90 billion in external debt repayments during 2026. At the same time, central banks remain cautious about cutting rates too aggressively while oil markets stay volatile. Because once currencies weaken and fuel costs rise, pressure can move quickly through transport, food, and household systems. And that is why policy space is becoming the real story. Not simply whether economies can grow, but how much room still exists once the next external shock arrives. In South Africa, mining sector optimism rose slightly amid negotiations over electricity pricing and industrial competitiveness. Meanwhile, the Libido Corridor remains one of the continent's most strategically watched infrastructure systems as competition over critical minerals routes continues. Across the continent, infrastructure, debt, energy, and trade remain increasingly connected. This week's pattern is simple. Progress is possible, but many African economies are still operating inside a narrower global system shaped by debt, costs, fuel pressure, and external financial conditions. And that means the real question is no longer only growth.